Welcome to The Technology Pill, a podcast that looks at how technology is reshaping our lives every day and exploring the different ways that governments and companies use tech to increase their power. My name is Gus Hossain, and I'm the Executive Director at Privacy International.
And I'm Caitlin, and I'm PI's Campaigns Officer. Hi.
This week, we're talking to Dr. Leonie Tanczer about her work looking at abuse in the Internet of Things. We've actually worked with Leonie for a number of years. She's at the University College London, which is an extraordinary academic institution that, we've worked with on and off over the years. But our relationship with Leonie goes back to 2018, if not even earlier, as we were looking at issues of gender. Then we started playing around with Internet of Things, and I think that's when we first started working with her. So it's so exciting to have her on the podcast.
We're thrilled to have Leonie, and as I'm sure you'll hear, she is a very interesting woman to talk to. A quick potential trigger warning here. We are largely going to be discussing gender-based violence and domestic abuse, along with, forms of coercive control that involve the Internet of Things. But if that's not your bag, or if it's not something you're up to listening to, maybe this is not the podcast for you. We have many other wonderful episodes, but have a think about what you're comfortable with before diving in.
My name is Dr. Leonie Tanczer. I'm an associate professor at University College London, and I run a small group of researchers, including PhD students and postdocs, that work all on issues around technology-facilitated abuse in the context of domestic violence.
I was going to say awesome, but that felt a bit
No.
Not quite right. But you do really, really interesting research, and obviously domestic abuse and violence is a extremely kind of heavy subject. How do you begin to investigate that?
Yeah, it's super interesting that we actually started off really looking into this at the start of 2018, actually with the work of and support of Privacy International, plus of course other organizations such as domestic abuse charities, support sector organizations that we were bringing on board, and over the years really tried to establish a relationship with, because I think one of the core importance of this work is that it's not done in a silo and not done in the so-called ivory tower, but actually has real world implications and is driven both by the needs of the sector, but also by the needs of, for example, policy officials, but also industry. And that's what we really try to do. And so how one starts with this work, I'm going to be very honest, I just fell into it. I was working on issues around smart internet-connected devices, the so-called Internet of Things, a really big buzzword that has been now replaced by AI, I guess. And I started to realize quite quickly that we looked at like the societal implications of these systems. I was always a bit struck by the fact that we didn't look overly much into vulnerable groups and communities. And domestic abuse is something that is very close to my heart. Is something that I've, been interested in for a very long time. And I just saw an opportunity to basically, connect that research on smart internet connected devices with that interest and that passion I have for that topic. And it started off as a pilot study in 2018 and just became a life and resulted in a life of its own. And now it's a really big research effort with multiple streams of programs and studies and people involved.
So if we start where it started with the Internet of Things, big questions, we'll probably have to narrow it down, but how have you found that IoT devices have impacted gender-based violence and abuse?
Hugely. I mean, I'm going to be very honest with you. At the start of 2018, when we run workshop with support sector organizations, we had to do a bit of an introduction to that topic to the people that sat in the room, but those that really work with victims and survivors, but also often sometimes perpetrators. And while there were instances at the start of it where smart systems were being misused, back in 2018, I think there was more curiosity about learning of what's on the horizon. And now we're in 2023, I think we really see things that we talked about nearly now 5 years ago are being actually used by perpetrators on a far more prevalent scale as that was back then. So we basically had just conversations with them of what devices, what systems they saw being abused, what the concerns were they had with the existing stuff that they saw being misused. And to this day, I think what smart internet devices change from, smartphones, laptop, and all the applications that run on these often systems is that like it is an opportunity to change the physical environment of a person, the living, the being in a place, in a house, in a flat, to an extent that wasn't possible before. Because if you think of a smartphone, if you think about a laptop, that's something you carry with you, but you can leave it somewhere. But if you think about like a smart doorbell, a smart camera that you install, if it's a smart kettle, thermostat, that's something that's in the built environment often. And the only way you can remove yourself is leaving that physical environment in many ways. And I think that's a big transition and change, plus also the fact that it allows for remote control. Now, we do see that, or have seen that with smartphones for a very long time. But I think, again, the uniqueness of many of the smart systems is that these are products that used to be offline, that we have in the household, that now are in our environment, are internet connected, and a person that is not with me in that room, in that space, can still control things from afar.
Have you found particular kinds of devices are more concerning than others? Because you mentioned like smart thermostats, and it never occurred to me that, smart thermostats would be on that list, to be honest.
So a really big flag I need to give at the start is like figure-wise, I think that's really hard to measure. And we're currently running a study to try to extract information out of records of support sector organization to kind of get a better number on this, because actually the umbrella term technology facilitated abuse is so broad. And so even if some organization have a tick box often to say, okay, there's tech abuse involved, it's down often to kind of the individual interpretation of a support sector organization, often of a support worker, whether that counts as tech abuse or not. Like, is this the excessive text messaging, or is this the installation of stalkerware that like is the threshold for this? So just to flag, the figures is something that we really struggle with. But what we have from like working with the support sector the last years, and like the anecdotal evidence that derives from interviews, focus groups, partly also like surveys, etc., is that the types of systems that are prevalent, available, and have been on the market for a while are the ones that are kind of the go-to systems. And what I mean with that is things that like are really affordable and like, easy to use. And that would be anything from, smart doorbells, smart TVs. Although smart TVs are an interesting one because we have observed a slight change in this, because I think there was a really big hype and smart TVs are on the market for far longer than other systems. But I think less and less of smart TVs have camera functionality, which I think is fascinating. So I think that there's a shift here, but they are still things that have been used. Cameras is, of course, the simplest one because cameras have historically always been used, but now with smart internet connected systems, you, again, have the opportunity to place that somewhere, leave, and like still have access to that environment from afar. The thermostat is an interesting one as well because it has been, or especially over the last years, been praised as this opportunity for energy efficiency, etc. It has been installed by government officials. Again, like the functionalities of these often change. But if you go for a kind of more self-imposed IoT device that you use in the environment, like the Nest or other things, they're more market driven and like people have to purchase that than rather being given by a housing estate, etc. But still, like they're quite popular. And I think especially over the last year where we had that discourse around like oil prices, energy prices rising, people I think have been encouraged nearly to use that to basically be able to monitor their usage. And I wonder what in the long run that will mean also for the prevalence of this being misused in the domestic abuse or in a coercive and controlling environment.
And you've looked at a lot of the different impacts, but that includes mental health. Have you seen kind of how does tech abuse in this way like affect people's mental health?
Yeah, I mean, domestic abuse, and I really want to stress we talk also increasingly more about coercion and control. It's part of the Domestic Abuse Act that we have since 2021. And a really important concept to bear in mind is gaslighting. And for those unfamiliar with this, it comes from a theater play, and it's the idea that like you start to slowly question your own sanity nearly. You start to wonder, like, am I envisioning this or is this really happening? And, you know, if you think about an abusive relationship, there's always a power dynamic here. So, you know, you may be degraded. You know, abuse is not just physical, it's emotional, it's sexual, it's financial. And as we try to push for, it's also like the element of the technical domain. But what that all feeds into is into that power dynamic and that hierarchy and control that is prevalent in a relationship between people. And so the mental health effects, of course, are profound because you start to feel like entrapped. You feel like you question often, like, am I still, you know, sane? For example, especially with tech, you may start to wonder, has this person really the capability to do that? We hear a lot about like victims and survivors, you know, being told certain things that the perpetrator is capable of doing, but they don't know, is that technically possible? Have they the capabilities, the funds, etc., to do that? But just the thought alone of this being an opportunity could prevent them and stifle them from doing certain things because they fear that it might be a possibility for that. And that's why my go-to phrase is that the overestimation of the technical capabilities is as dangerous as the underestimation. And what I mean with that is the perpetrator telling someone, their victims and survivor, that they have a friend who's a hacker, or that they go to, you know, places like the dark web. Nobody can see me now, but I'm making like exclamation marks here because they use these terms that we see actually on the news being used for criminals, where you see people like typing on a terminal and, you know, like make us think that the cyber criminals are all out there and like work their balaclava. But basically these same images are being then used by perpetrators to say, oh, I have a friend who's a hacker, I have hired a hacker for hire service, etc., which they may not have done and most likely won't have done. But still, like, putting that in front of someone makes them think, okay, there's might be a chance of that and I don't want to risk it. And the other side of that coin is where a perpetrator may not tell a victim and survivor that they have installed these systems, and many of which are tiny, like sensors or tiny cameras. And then perhaps they start to observe that the perpetrator knows certain things, but they don't know why they know these things or why they're capable of knowing aspects of their life that they shouldn't know, which then again like creates this fear and again like question of sanity. Am I going crazy? And so yeah, the mental health implications are just, you know, profound and substantial, where one starts to fear literally everything. They start to have anxiety and worry about the devices that they have, but also the long-term effects that has on questioning the trust that someone has towards other people, but really trust towards the systems, the devices that they're using in the future.
So it sounds quite a lot like technology hype, but also increasingly literal technology allows abusers to create an almost omniscience. Like,
yeah,
you can see everything, you can do everything, and therefore the abusee can't do anything for fear of an abuser who is everywhere.
Absolutely. And I think what I really want to stress is that there are huge gender dimensions to this. So, I mean, there's a long history of research and academic thought and discussion around like the gendered implication of technology. And there's great work being done by many scholars like Professor Judy Weitzman, etc., that have long worked around like how technology is gendered, like who is it that designs systems? But it's not just that, it's also, we see that in the representation, but also in the usage and the control of devices, with gendered aspect come into play. And in many heterosexual relationships, if you think about, like, if you're listening to this and you're in a relationship yourself, perhaps you're thinking, who is in charge of the decisions, what is being purchased, how it is being set up, how is it maintained, and how it is being disposed, and when it is being disposed. And as research has shown, in, again, heterosexual relationships, it's often the man that is in charge of that. They are choosing what's the best system to install. Often they are the ones that have set up the account. They're the legal account holder. They are also the owner of the device often. And that brings then a lot of like problems with it once, for example, a relationship breaks up and, you know, you have shared systems, for example, shared data that is there. Or in an abusive relationship, the question is then also like, have I even like consented to that data being collected? And so that's a really important aspect to highlight. And what we also see is we constantly get being told, especially by female victims and survivors, but also by support sector organizations where a lot of women work, that they are saying to us, I'm not tech savvy. And, you know, I feel like that's the same kind of category of like women being told for decades, centuries, you can't do maths or science. And that idea that I'm not the person that can work with this or should work with this is also feeding into that opportunity for often male perpetrators to misuse technology, because they can like tell things to their victims and survivors, make them believe certain things, but also they're the ones that like purchase these things often at a time when perhaps like everything on paper looks fine in a relationship, and say, I have purchased you that phone and set that up already for you because I love you. And that really makes it really hard to extract people out of this relationship, because then one has to start to talk, okay, do you know that password, or how do you reset that system, etc.
I mean, if someone is concerned about their devices, their technological environment, what can or should they be doing? Like, is there someone they can call?
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's an important element, and one that I think deserves far more attention. I think, you know, for anyone listening to this and being worried about like issues around domestic abuse, stalking, etc., there are fantastic support sector organizations in the UK that would be my recommendation as a first go-to place. Whether this is Women's Aid, Refuge, the Susie Lamplugh Trust, any of these organizations have this on the radar. And many have started to tackle especially technological aspects in their support infrastructure. So, for example, Refuge has a dedicated tech abuse team that can help victims and survivors, you know, that are perhaps like extremely worried about the technological aspects of their environment. So this is definitely my go-to recommendation. I think the bigger question I have is, what about all these people that like are not perhaps in an abusive relationship, but still are worried about their tech? Where are they being sent to? And of course, there is some outlets out there that provide some support, but there's always the question of quality control. But for example, I mean, there is partially public-facing work being done by the National Cybersecurity Centre. Of course, there's great work being done by many charities, NGOs like, you know, Prevalent International, but also I'm thinking about Access Now, etc. There is the Security Planner, which is a great tool that is being developed by colleagues in Canada, that even if you are in the UK, I think still applies, because the systems are the same in our global economy. So there are some great resources out there, but it's again the knowledge that people must have to A, question that, and B, look out for that. And I think, yeah, there's more public awareness raising need to be done to create that like consideration of like safety and security of these systems are important. How are we setting those up correctly?
Are there things that smart device creators should be doing to safeguard people a little bit more?
Yeah, so we're really actively trying to work with industry stakeholders and inform their work as well, as much as we can be informed by what they think is on the horizon. I know that organizations such as IBM, which is not really a corporation that's very kind of consumer focused in many ways, but still have started to work on this internally by having put forward 5 design principles that they try to adhere to when developing products around coercion and control, that they try to bring awareness to their own engineers in the company. But I also recognize that many of these big players are huge. They operate on a global scale, and like what one team does like in the UK may not trickle down to colleagues in, you know, San Francisco in the US. And so I think that's a big challenge with many of these product vendors. But what we have been trying to highlight based on like usability tests we did with some of the devices and our work observing what's happening on the ground is really a core like guidance, I think, is prompts and notifications. My spiel is normally to say we're moving from a personal device environment, PC, if that's what the PC stood for, to a shared device ecosystem. So it's no longer I, Leonie, have one device, one laptop, one phone, but it's I work in an office where there's shared like sensors, etc., being installed. I live in an environment where with my partner, my family, we have shared systems that we should probably all have account access to and that we all use, but like data from all of us is collected to, but where perhaps we have different usability permissions of I'm the one that is in charge, my husband is like second account holder but can't change these features. And I think as a collective society, both in a tech space but also as humans, we haven't really found yet like rules around these shared device systems. And so I think a really important thing is prompts and notifications. So all the people that are connected to a system are reminded that data is still collected or that your account is still connected. The best example I can give is, which is not IoT related, but how often have you logged into your Spotify account at a party at your friend's house? You forgot that by the time you left the party at 2 a.m., that you perhaps like that is still open. And I think we see that with many software-based companies like, Gmail, Dropbox, etc. They have started to kind of send reminders. Someone with that IP address based here has been trying to log on. Are you approving of that? And I think we need to have the kind of same settings and prompts and notifications in regards to IoT, where the interconnectedness of devices is going to be so much bigger and where so much more devices are going to try to connect to one another.
That's really interesting because it's so simple. And it comes back to a lot of the data protection and security practices that, a kind of baseline minimum, but could protect people, I guess, in
Yes.
so many more situations. And I mean, you've looked a bit, I think, at the legal framework in the UK, the Computer Misuse Act. Yep. How much do current legal frameworks capture this kind of abuse?
Yeah. Oh. Yeah. This is such a difficult topic because the reason why we looked at the Computer Misuse Act 1990 is because it's a very, very old legislation. And anyone who has encountered this legislation before will know that it has, in its long period of existence, been heavily contested, but also that it has always been very much focused on external threat actors, aka cyber criminals, hackers, whatever you think of that. Plus, it had always had a very economic focused angle. So it's a legislation that is very much for businesses, and that's the flavor it gives. But when you read the text, it is quite broad and all-encompassing, and it boils down to the simple phrase, unauthorized access. And the main reason why we looked at the CMA, the Computer Misuse Act, is because unauthorized access is literally everything we're seeing when it comes to technology-facilitated domestic abuse. Because it is a person not having given you the consent to access my email account, my systems, etc. And so we looked at, and there's so many caveats to this study, but we looked at court judgments that have been basically put forward and involved the CMA, the Computer Misuse Act, since its inception, and looked at if it has ever been used on to cases of domestic abuse. Now, I really want to stress, and that's the big caveat, that we could only look at publicly available court judgments, which means that if you're not familiar with the legal system in the UK, and I should perhaps stress here, this is only England and Wales, we can only see judgment that have basically gone to the higher level courts. So anything that happened on magistrate level, like the kind of where the majority of court cases start off, we could not access those because there are no public transcripts of this. So we could only look at what's publicly available, which is, of course, only a tiny fraction of what's happening in courts in England and Wales. But yeah, looking at historically from all the ones that we could look at, there's been only a tiny element. First of all, the CMA is not, there's not many court cases that involve the CMA for as a starting point. And secondly, there's been hints of domestic abuse in one or two cases, like a handful of cases, but it has not been ever that the judge would have used this for a domestic abuse, like a perpetrator being unauthorized to access a system. And it was just a kind of an intellectual curiosity, because I was thinking about the CMA loads of the times when I worked with domestic abuse victims and survivors and support sector organizations, because that would be one way of prosecuting that individual. But what the majority of current prosecution in domestic abuse cases use is kind of harassment, etc., kind of the go-to things that we always have used when it comes to domestic abuse, etc. There's loads of debate of a need for complementary legislation. For example, we have now opportunities to prosecute people for issues around revenge porn, which is actually a not very well thought out term. The preferred version is like image-based sexual abuse. So anyone sharing intimate images about you without the consent and distributing that online and through other means can be prosecuted through that. But again, like that doesn't account for many of the other things that like we see, which is, installing stalkerware, spyware on someone's phone, etc. And again, that for me is boiling down to unauthorized access. So I'm just astonished why we have not like shifted the focus from the CMA to being a business focused legislation to perhaps like something that can be used in person to person like misuse. And I think there's more to be done, and perhaps like a bigger conversation to be had like with barristers, judges, training sessions, etc. on why this is not a go-to piece of legislation that we could also use in this case.
I ask because I was interested, because the Computer Misuse Act, which is incredibly broad, would be so useful for this area, but the whole law is so non-specific, because in the 1990s they were like, anything? I think the US has a similarly broad and scary legal framework, which I don't know if it would be similarly useful, but is also scarily broad in ways that make us deeply uncomfortable. Speaking of legal frameworks, has there been, or have you seen, or is there any way of, or any situations in which people have started using IoT devices as evidence in domestic abuse cases? Because we've started seeing like smartwatches and I think there was a fridge once being brought as evidence in other cases.
Definitely these devices, I normally call them systems because they're actually quite broad, and it's hardware, it's software, it's many things. They offer opportunities for evidence collection, which can be used in prosecution. With that being said, our research and studies by other colleagues have shown that there's a huge backlog of devices, systems that wait to be analyzed in rape cases, in sexual abuse cases, in domestic abuse cases, but in many other offenses as well by the police. And that's due to the fact that there is, of course, a shortage of personnel within the police forces to basically do that analysis, which has to be done, by certified individuals and be done thoroughly so that it holds and stands a chance in court, where, of course, one side will claim that this hasn't been analyzed properly or there's a flaw, etc. So it's a, double-edged sword. While it is great to have that opportunity and victims and survivors have this possibility, for example, to use screenshots, to use logs, etc. in court to showcase, for example, that unauthorized access has taken place. If it really came down to basically them making a claim around that, sometimes police doesn't have the capacities to do that. And often for kind of domestic abuse cases, the police doesn't get that much involved. They would go involved in a homicide, in something quite substantial. But if it's boiling down to, for example, a custody case for children, which is a big part of like domestic abuse elements, where children are a means for the perpetrator to stay in touch with the victim and survivor through that means, or just, for example, a divorce case, which all happen kind of again on this magistrates level, on the family court level, then nobody has often the financial means, the capacity, or nor does anybody think about that to be a part of the debate of these conversations. And then you have to probably pay for someone to do that. And again, like then the other side could stand in court and say, we have our security analyst who says that's not the case. So this is a possibility for criminal investigation where kind of the state is involved and where there is this, like as I said, homicides, etc., where perhaps those funds are available. But again, it boils down to the fact that it requires capacities within the police to do that, which often are not there because, lack of funding, etc.
Have there been any, and you can say I don't want to answer this question, that's fine, but have there been any stories that you've encountered that have really stuck with you?
I mean, the sad thing is, I say sad, I really value when people get in touch with us directly, even though I really want to stress, we're doing this as researchers and we try to work with victims and survivors through established means, secure and safe means. That means working with support sector organizations, for example, and accessing people through that. But we have people like emailing us, and I think it is often heartbreaking when people get in touch, with their stories and like are devastated. And, I get goosebumps just thinking about this, like basically nearly crying and saying, I don't know what I should do. And it puts us as academics in quite a difficult position because I do hesitate to give advice because I do not know the full circumstances under which these people live. I don't want to endanger them by saying, do this, do that. And it's the same challenge that like support sector organizations also have, but at least there's often an infrastructure there with like people that have specialized training in like counseling, etc. Plus they have legal experts and support, and also a means to get people, like, for example, into a refuge, into a safe house, etc. So, of course, my go-to recommendation is for these stories to often immediately direct them to support services that I know are at the forefront of this and where I feel like they're going to be in safe hands, which is often difficult if it's like people getting in touch with me from abroad, where I do know organizations that I will point them to, but, I have often less information about them. But yeah, so, I mean, there's been several like stories with people like really like unsure what is happening and if they're envisioning this, that feeds into that gaslighting element that I said. Is stalker installed? Can they be sure that it's there? How would they check it's there, for example? We also heard like from support organization, again, it's I don't want to sound like a broken record, but it's the one that it's just stood out for me, where we were asked the question that a victim and survivor was being told by the perpetrator that a Roomba, a smart vacuum cleaner, had, these functionalities and also knives installed. Is that possible? And like, I think a lot of people's first reaction is to kind of smile and laugh. But actually, the fact that they said this and the fact that this came to us and we were asked this question means that people really started to worry, is that a possibility? And I think that's what I really mean with like the overestimation and underestimation that I mentioned earlier, is that we should not disregard people's fears about these systems when they sound perhaps like ludicrous for, the funky male bloke that like, sits in a tech startup and like thinks this is ridiculous. Why would you even ask that question? But I think, my big anger currently is we have this environment where, if you live in London, they don't have that ad up anymore. And I hope Oral-B will not like be angry at me for saying this, but like Oral-B had like this advert up on the posters when you went down the tube saying, our smart toothbrush is AI driven. And, let's be honest, that's a complete overselling of what really happens. It's a toothbrush that like, indicates that like you should brush 2 minutes more on that side than the other. But on the other hand, we have like the whole discussion currently around machine learning, AI, large language model, it's like so boosted up. People talk about like the eradication of humanity and whatnot, which I think is so overblown. No, don't get me wrong, I think it's important that we talk about it, but I do feel like we should talk about it in realistic and like measured ways. And a lot of companies, and it is a lot of companies, are pushing for kind of this hype because it allows them to get more funds, etc., that are currently actually being released. And that puts then the people that are feeling like they see the low-hanging fruit of what tech is. And that's like social media, it's harassment, it's getting excessive text messages, it's getting dick pics, it's getting spyware installed, etc. And they kind of see the negative aspects, but also just like kind of the scratch of the surface. And they probably often think, well, they're talking about these grand things. Perhaps I'm exposed to these grand harms that like are lying ahead. And I think we need to be far better in educating the public about like the real reality of that's there. And again, like with the risk of sounding like a broken record, we had a workshop a few years ago, and some participant whose name, like, unfortunately, we didn't record it for this, but gave the example, we need a David Attenborough for tech, basically. And I think that holds true. I think we need like this go-to person that runs great documentaries about the lived reality of what we are actually seeing with tech, instead of that hype around Black Mirror and what we are kind of exposed to. And just, be real about what we actually have, and that AI models are basically just if and what statements, and they're not as smart as they try to convey to us. And that while there is a risk and while there are harms that already come out of it, the reality of what they are is often overblown. It's the misuse that comes from them that is really the challenge. So yeah, that's my long-winded answer of like, actually what you probably asked, which is like some concrete examples. Sorry about that.
No. And I think it's a really interesting point about tech hype, because we do see a crazy amount of hype, and it has so many harms from, we see it in education with schools buying up systems that don't make sense and aren't that good for education, because personalized learning, artificial intelligence, all this stuff. We see it in government contracts with systems that the government can't explain what they do but sound great. We see it all over the place, and tech hype is having real serious harms in so many fields. It's really interesting to think that it has such a concrete harm in this one. I mean, it's like, and you can see it all the time. We get a lot of, is Facebook using my microphone for advertising? And the answer is probably not, but they are using your data in ways that are much more insidious than you might have thought, because they are leading to these outcomes whereby you think, well, surely the most logical thing is Facebook is listening to my conversations. It's like, well, no, but, and balancing those between the volume of data they have on you is leading to these outcomes that are so scary and insidious, but they don't have access to your microphone that we think for advertising at the moment. So it is really interesting, and I think the David Attenborough of technology would be amazing, would be brilliant. Is there anything that you wanted to cover that you haven't?
I mean, I think there's great research and work being done in this domain. Like, I really think for people that are really interested in learning more about this, there's in the UK work done by Refuge that I mentioned. They have a really cool website called Tech versus Abuse. I think that's how the URL is. But if you could type it into your preferred search engine, I'm sure you will find it.
We'll put it in the description for people as well.
And I feel like we're actually running a monthly newsletter on this topic for anyone interested, that I would highly encourage people to sign up for. I think, honestly, in many ways, what we talk about is a societal problem. I mean, don't get me wrong, there are technical elements that facilitate this. But domestic abuse, coercion and control is a societal problem that by definition will not be solved through technology, because it is a societal issue. Like, abuse is mediated through tech, facilitated through it, but in the end, it's like an issue between human beings. And I think we, as a society, should not think that it believes that tech will fix that. So developing yet another app or a flashy website or whatever, or an AI model, my favorite example, nor will it also purely be resolved by just thinking we disregard the misuse that happens at this moment of time. So I do think we need to take into account like what's going wrong. We need to have the figures and the numbers to showcase, okay, X amount of victims are faced with this type of abuse through, let's say, an Apple AirTag. Well, Apple, you have a responsibility to address that. And I think currently a lot of the organizations are leaning back and saying, well, show me the figures and then I will be open to talking to you. And that's why I'm so keen to get those stats, because I feel like that's such an easy excuse. And I'm glad to see some developments, especially on the European Union level, around the Digital Service Act and other legislation, where there is now this accountability required from corporation to kind of release information and give access to researchers like, well, hopefully like myself and others, to kind of access that data to analyze what's happening. Because I do think there's a lot of information that we don't see that perhaps like goes directly to the support helplines of, you know, the organizations that we talked about. And I feel like there's more to be done, but it will not be an easy solution that will be fixed through legislation, that will not be fixed through purely technical means, because it's often a dual use issue that applies to so many other things where we have dual use issues, where a knife can be used for cutting vegetables, but it can also be to kill a person. And we have that with tech now as well. And it will not be solved just by improving the support sector and giving funding there. Although I think that is a really urgent need. I think it requires improvements on all levels, but just basically a larger debate around like what is a healthy relationship where consent starts and ends, and that people, and especially young people, understand like it's not okay, you know, for you to request like certain things from your partner, just like it's not okay, for example, for parents to request certain things from children when it comes to tech, and set them kind of precedent that that's normal and I love you and that's why the reason why I surveil you. So it's like, it's an unsatisfying answer, which basically says we need to tackle this from several fronts, which is not a quick solvable solution that is available here. But I do think that's the only mean to address that.
That makes sense. You can't fix the tech issues and assume domestic abuse will go away. Domestic abuse would need to go away for tech abuse to go away.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much for your time. I really, really, really appreciate it. It's been really, really interesting talking to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening. Remember, you could tell us what you think of the podcast by visiting us at pvcy.org/TP-survey. You can sign up to be the first to learn more about our work at pvcy.org/podsignup. And we'll include some links to relevant articles and information in the description wherever you're listening, or on our website at pvcy.org/techpill. Don't forget to rate and subscribe to the podcast on whichever platform you use. Music courtesy of Sepia. This podcast was produced by Max Burnell for Privacy International.